In 1898, American author Morgan Robertson published a novella titled Futility, which tells the story of the Titan, a British ocean liner described as the largest, fastest, and most luxurious in the world. On its maiden voyage across the North Atlantic, the Titan accidentally collides with an iceberg. Though the ship is designed to survive a head-on collision, the iceberg instead strikes a glancing blow, allowing several watertight compartments to flood at once and causing the Titan to rapidly capsize and sink. Tragically, the ship does not carry enough lifeboats for all aboard, and only 13 of her passengers and crew survive the sinking. If this story seems strangely familiar to you, then you are not alone, for Futility, later renamed The Wreck of the Titan, has become infamous for predicting the real-life 1912 sinking of the RMS Titanic. But this was far from the first time that nautical life imitated art, for just 5 years before, an even more gruesome tragedy was predicted with eerie accuracy by none other than the master of the macabre himself, Edgar Allan Poe. This is the story of one of the strangest coincidences in all of modern literature that led to a groundbreaking court case. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his first, and ultimately only, full-length novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. A departure from Poe's typical horror short stories, the book is an epic pulp-adventure tale which follows its titular hero as he stows away aboard the whaling ship Grampus and encounters a series of increasingly extreme perils, including mutiny, shipwreck, corpse-strewn ghost vessel, hostile islanders, and even mythical beasts. Important to the story today is at one point Pym and 3 other sailors find themselves adrift at sea in a lifeboat. Though at first they managed to catch and eat a sea turtle, no further food is forthcoming, and they soon began slowly dying of starvation and thirst. With no land or ships in sight, they decide to invoke the ancient custom of the sea, drawing straws to decide who among them will be killed and eaten to save the others. The unfortunate recipient of the short straw is the Grampus's cabin boy, Richard Parker. The desperate ritual works, keeping the remaining sailors alive long enough to be rescued. The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket was met with mixed reviews, with longtime Poe critic Lewis Gaylord Clark writing, "The story is told in a loose and slipshod style, seldom checkered by any of the more common graces of composition. Yet this work is one of much interest with all its defects, not the least of which is that it is too liberally stuffed with horrid circumstances of blood and battle." Even Poe himself dismissed the book as very silly. Nonetheless, the book proved surprisingly influential, with no less a figure than Herman Melville partially crediting Poe with inspiring his legendary 1851 work Moby Dick. French writer Jules Verne even wrote a sequel titled Antarctic Mystery in 1897. Nonetheless, it is likely that Poe's only novel would have remained a mere footnote in his bibliography were it not for an infamous real-life incident which took place 50 years later. In 1884, 31-year-old Captain Thomas Dudley, an experienced British sailor, was hired to sail the private yacht Mignonette from Southampton, England to Sydney, Australia. Built in 1867, the 16-meter-long Mignonette had been purchased by wealthy Australian lawyer Jack Want, who hoped that the English-built vessel would improve his standing in the British yachting community. For his crew on the 24,000-kilometer voyage, Dudley chose 3 men, 37-year-old Edwin Stevens and 38-year-old Edmund Brooks, both experienced seamen, and an inexperienced 17-year-old cabin boy named, you guessed it, Richard Parker. On May 19, 1884, Dudley and his crew set sail from Southampton and headed south. As the Mignonette was an inshore craft not designed for long ocean voyages, Dudley chose not to sail through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, where winds were unfavorable for a small sailing vessel. Instead, he decided to sail down and around Africa and across the Indian Ocean to Australia, hugging the shore as much as possible. At first, the voyage was uneventful and the weather fair, with the Mignonette reaching the Cape of Good Hope on the morning of July 5th. That afternoon, however, storm clouds began to gather on the horizon, and Captain Dudley pushed his crew to sail at full speed to stay ahead of the weather. By the evening, it seemed as though they had succeeded, and Dudley ordered the ship to drop anchor so he and his crew could enjoy a well-deserved rest. But then, while the crew were fast asleep, disaster struck. A rogue wave slammed into the Mignonette broadside, tearing open her hull and causing her to rapidly take on water. Scrambling about in pitch darkness, the 4-man crew barely managed to climb aboard the yacht's tiny 4-meter lifeboat before the Mignonette sank away beneath them. As dawn broke the following morning, the crew assessed their situation. The news was grim. The lifeboat was flimsy and leaky, had no mast or sail, and only 1 pair of oars to propel it. In their haste to escape the sinking ship, the crew had managed to save little else than the clothes on their backs and 2 1-pound tins of turnips. They had no water, no maps, and were some 2,500 kilometers from the nearest land. Worse still, they had deliberately avoided commercial shipping routes in favor of calmer waters, making their chances of being discovered by a passing ship even more remote. As the days passed, the crew of the Mignonette faced hardship after hardship. With no canopy to protect against the sun or warm clothing, they baked during the day and froze during the night. On one occasion, they were forced to fight off hungry sharks, while in another, Richard Parker fell overboard and had to be saved by Dudley, the only member of the crew who could swim. Meanwhile, the meager rations of turnips were quickly used up, and while the crew managed to catch and devour a passing sea turtle, this only sustained them for a handful of days. With no further food forthcoming, starvation soon set in. But far more agonizing was the men's thirst. With no water except the small amount of rain they could catch in their oilskin cloaks, by the 13th of July, the crew had taken to drinking their own urine. Then on July the 20th, a delirious and desperate Richard Parker made the mistake of drinking large quantities of seawater. He became violently ill and soon slipped into a coma. By this time, Captain Dudley had come to a grim conclusion. After 2 weeks adrift without food or water, unless they were rescued soon, they were as good as dead. They had only one choice. He told his first mate, Stevens, invoke the ancient custom of the sea, casting lots to see who would be killed and eaten for the survival of the others. Stevens reluctantly agreed, and the pair approached Brooks with their plan. But Brooks was horrified by the suggestion and refused to entertain the idea. Unable to bring him around, Dudley dropped the matter. After 3 more days, however, Dudley could take it no more, and once more tried to coax Brooks into drawing lots. When Brooks once again refused, Dudley came up with a new plan. Instead of drawing lots, they would eat Richard Parker. After all, he was seemingly already doomed to be the first among them to die anyway. At the time, sailors considered drinking seawater a death sentence. It was only a matter of time before the boy expired. Furthermore, Dudley argued Parker was an orphan, while the rest of the crew were family men whose deaths would leave their wives and children destitute. If there was a man among them whose death would matter least, it was Parker. And while the very idea was abhorrent to civilized men, was it not better for one man to die so that 3 could live? But while Stevens agreed in principle, there was one complicating factor. In order to maximize the amount of meat to eat and blood to drink, Dudley proposed they kill Parker rather than wait for him to waste away. For this reason, Stevens demurred. Fed up with arguing, Dudley announced that if they were not rescued by the following morning, he would carry out the unpleasant deed himself. The morning of July the 25th, 20 days since the Mignonette's sinking, brought no sign of land or other ships. The time had come. While Stevens held Parker's feet, Dudley leaned over the semi-conscious body, muttering a short prayer, and plunged a pocket knife into Richard Parker's jugular vein, killing him. Immediately, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks set upon the body, cutting off the hands and feet and tossing them overboard and devouring the muscles and internal organs. Though he defended his decision until the end, Dudley was still disturbed by the scene, later writing that, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my 2 unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We all was like mad wolves who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason." 4 days later, on July 29th, the crew of the Mignonette was spotted and rescued by the German ship Moctezuma, 1,500 kilometers east of Brazil. They had been lost at sea for 24 days, during which time they had drifted nearly 1,700 kilometers. Though the grisly remains of Richard Parker in the bottom of the boat left little doubt as to what had happened, the crew of the Moctezuma were unconcerned and treated the survivors with the utmost hospitality. On September the 6th, 1884, 110 days after the Mignonette's departure, the Moctezuma docked at Falmouth, where Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks received a hero's welcome. But when they recounted their ordeal to the local customs house, they suddenly found themselves being arrested and charged with murder. This came as a great shock, for at the time most sailors considered survival cannibalism to be an accepted part of life at sea. Indeed, according to Professor Richard Simpson in his classic account, Cannibalism and the Common Law, if properly conducted, cannibalism was legitimated by a custom of the sea. Survivors who had followed the custom could have certain professional pride in a job well done. There was nothing to hide. Unfortunately for the crew of the Mignonette, Edmund Brooks proved a little too open about their grisly exploits. Giddy and euphoric over his survival, he gleefully recounted the killing and devouring of Richard Parker in a casual, even humorous manner that raised many eyebrows in the maritime community, using such phrases as we was having our breakfast, we will call it, and our hearts were in our mouths, to describe the macabre feast. Meanwhile, the British courts had long been troubled by the custom of the sea, seeing it as a dangerous legal loophole. The specific legal principle at issue was that of necessity, whether any circumstances could be deemed extreme or desperate enough to truly necessitate the killing of another human being. This defense had originally arisen following the loss of the American passenger ship William Brown, which struck an iceberg and sank off the coast of Newfoundland on April 19, 1841. 51 of her 82 passengers and crew survived the sinking and climbed into 2 lifeboats, 10 in one and 41 in the other. As the weather began to worsen, it became clear that the second boat was dangerously overloaded, leading the crew members to throw 16 passengers overboard to their deaths in order to lighten the load. After the remaining survivors were rescued, Alexander Holmes, the only member of the crew who could be located, was arrested and tried for murder. He was eventually convicted of a lesser charge of manslaughter, serving only 6 months in prison. But while the United States versus Home appeared to uphold the defense of necessity, the Mignonette case differed in one key respect. Captain Dudley had unilaterally decided to kill Richard Parker rather than carrying out the customary ritual of drawing lots, an act that smacked of outright premeditated murder. Furthermore, it was not Parker himself who endangered the lives of his comrades, but rather hunger, thirst, and the elements. Indeed, as American legal historian Henry Winthrop Hardin argued in his 1886 analysis of the case, that necessity of a certain sort is a sufficient justification for an act which would otherwise be murder was not denied. If a highwayman assaulted a traveler upon the road, and the latter, in seeking to escape and defend himself, kill his assailant, the homicide is excusable on the ground of necessity. If the boy Parker, immediately before the knife reached his neck, and in order to save his own life, had by any means succeeded in killing Dudley, the homicide would have been excusable on the ground of necessity. Manifestly, the necessity which would justify Parker in taking the life of his assailant is of a very different sort from the necessity which would justify Dudley in making the assault. And if one be recognized as legally sufficient necessity and the other be not, it is a dangerous legal equivocation to describe both sorts by the same word. It merely adds confusion to the Mignonette case to describe it by the term which the defense applied to it. Necessity, as previously defined in the law of homicide, has a fixed legal character and should not be tampered with. Thus, for the British legal establishment, the Mignonette case provided an ideal opportunity to challenge the precedent set by United States versus Home and hopefully close the custom of the sea loophole once and for all. However, the prosecutor faced a formidable challenge, for public sentiment lay squarely with the 3 cannibals. Wherever Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks went, people doffed their hats in respect, while both the mayor of Falmouth, who ordered the men's arrest, and the trial prosecutor received multiple death threats. Even the brother of Richard Parker openly forgave Thomas Dudley in open court and shook his hand, while the tombstone on Parker's grave bore the remarkably forgiving epitaph, "Though he slay me, yet I will trust him. Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." Furthermore, since the only witnesses to the event aboard the lifeboat were the defendants themselves, this meant they reserved the right to silence and that their testimonies could not be used against their fellow defendants. Meanwhile, Captain Dudley had accepted full responsibility for the death of Richard Parker, insisting that Edmund Brooks had taken no part in the killing and, despite having partaken in the body, was completely innocent. Brooks was consequently released without charge and became the chief witness for the prosecution. Consequently, the prosecution took the unusual step of forbidding the jury from returning a verdict, lest they simply acquit the defendants, and instead permitted them only to determine the hard facts of the case. The case would then be passed up to a special tribunal of 5 judges headed by Lord Chief Justice Lord Coleridge, who would deliver the final judgment. This was a highly unorthodox procedure which had not been employed in nearly a century and proved highly controversial. Yet despite these elaborate measures, the court exercised a surprising degree of leniency towards the 2 defendants, even granting them bail and allowing them to return home until the start of the trial proper, something almost unheard of in capital cases at the time. The trial of the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens began on November 3, 1884 at the Exeter Assizes, presided over by Baron Huddleston. Arthur Charles QC led for the prosecution and Arthur Collins QC for the defense, their salaries being paid out of the Public Defense Fund. In his opening remarks, Charles rejected outright the defense of necessity, stating that the crew's peril was not directly caused by Richard Parker and that the standard of self-defense did not apply. He also rejected the insanity defense, pointing to Dudley's prayer prior to the killing as proof that he was aware of the gravity of his actions. Dudley and Stevens' argument that their situation was analogous to wartime, wherein it is accepted that men have a duty to sacrifice themselves for the good of others, was also dismissed, with the court stating that to preserve one's life is generally speaking a duty, but it may be the plainest and the highest duty to sacrifice it. War is full of instances in which it is a man's duty not to live, but to die. At this point, Judge Huddleston stated that he had already made up his mind regarding the law and would accept no further submissions from the defense. Instead, Edmund Brooks was called to the stand, where he delivered a compelling testimony about the desperate conditions aboard the lifeboat, Richard Parker's inevitable death from dehydration, and the impossibility of he, Dudley, and Stevens surviving more than a day or two longer without resorting to cannibalism. Following cross-examination, Judge Huddleston pushed the jury to accept a special verdict which he himself had written, validating Brooks' testimony and stating that, but whether upon the whole matter the prisoners were and are guilty of murder, the jury are ignorant and refer to the court. If this rather rushed procedure seems highly unusual, remember that the prosecution's goal was not to unduly punish Dudley and Stevens, whom it was generally agreed had already suffered enough, but rather to officially destroy the defense of necessity and close a troublesome legal loophole. Indeed, while at the time a conviction of murder automatically brought with it a sentence of death, arrangements had already been made for Dudley and Stevens to have their sentences commuted by Queen Victoria on the advice of Home Secretary William Harcourt. And so it was that on December the 9th, 1884, Lord Coleridge delivered a verdict of guilty, stating that the duty in a case of shipwreck of a captain to his crew, of the crew to the passengers, of soldiers to women and children, these duties impose on men the moral necessity, not of preservation, but of their sacrifice of their lives for others. It is not correct, therefore, to say there is an absolute or unqualified necessity to preserve one's life. Who is to judge of this sort of necessity? By what measure is the comparative value of lives to be measured? Is it to be strength or intellect or what? As planned, 3 days later, on December the 12th, Home Secretary Harcourt commuted Dudley and Stevens' sentences to 6 months imprisonment. Once again, the courts afforded the pair considerable leniency, granting them special privileges such as access to visitors, outside communication, and food other than the standard prison fare. The two were released on May the 20th, 1885, 1 year and a day since the Mignonette had put out to sea. As for Edmund Brooks, he had already returned to sea, dying in 1919 at the age of 73. Edwin Stevens, meanwhile, settled down in Southampton and supported himself working odd jobs, but was gradually, allegedly driven mad by his oceanic ordeal, and either way died in 1914 at the age of 67. As for Thomas Dudley, he immigrated to Sydney, Australia, where he became a successful nautical outfitter before dying of bubonic plague in 1900 at the age of 47. The Queen versus Dudley and Stevens has become one of the most infamous and well-studied legal cases in history, being taught to nearly all first-year law students in the United Kingdom and the United States. The case represents a fascinating intersection of ethics, morality, and law, asking us to ponder where one begins and the other ends, and under what circumstances, if any, can the unthinkable be justified. It's also one of the most famous and chilling cases of life imitating art, so eerily similar are the details of the case to those of Edgar Allan Poe's fictional narrative from a half-century earlier. Indeed, in the annals of maritime disaster, the name Richard Parker shows up time and time again, creating one of history's strangest coincidences. Appropriate, then, that in his award-winning 2001 novel, Life of Pi, the story of a young boy adrift at sea with a Bengal tiger, Canadian author Yann Martel chose to name said tiger Richard Parker.